Welcome, good afternoon or good morning, depending where you're joining us from. Welcome to our webinar on for-purpose M&A. We'll give it a few minutes just for people to file in and then we'll get started. I'm Andrew Bird, the MD of Foundstone Advisory, and you're stuck with me as your host today. I'm joining from Melbourne, Wurundjeri country. And it'd be great to, as you're joining, just to jot in the chat where you're joining us from. We've got a real mix of registrations from across Australia and a couple from New Zealand, I believe, as well. So it'd be great if you could jot in where you're joining us from. We've got a really interesting mix of panellists for you today. Sally, Mathew, and Jason, and I'll be introducing them all shortly. And we've got a real mix of those that have registered, signed up, real mix from across providers, primary care, community healthcare, disability, aged care, education, social enterprise, as well as philanthropy, foundations, some universities and peak bodies, and then consulting, research, legal and accounting. So a really, really good mix. Welcome, Mark, Marianne, Myron, Heidi, Adelaide, Melbourne, Ballarat. Welcome, Peter. It's surprisingly a beautiful sunny spring day in Melbourne here. Mathew is joining us from New South Wales. Always sunny up there, isn't it, Mathew, compared to this part of the world?
Beautiful part of the world, the Illawarra, actually. So yeah, beautiful weather today.
Fantastic, fantastic. So part of the intent today is to really bring, a live and practical conversation around M&A, because sometimes the topic can be sometimes a bit transactional and even theoretical. So we'll be covering a number of live examples, previous examples, and some key learnings from the panel. And hopefully also touch on a couple of the potentially those elephants in the room, those subjects around M&A which are sometimes avoided, the real human aspects to M&A. So hopefully we'll be covering a bit of those as well. Welcome, Patrick, Bernie, Kent, etc. All right, let's kick it off. Again, I'm Andrew Bird, the founder and MD of Foundstone Advisory. We're an impact-led strategy advisory working primarily across the for-purpose sector, and quite a large part of work we do more recently is really helping organisations really embed their M&A strategy within the broader strategic plan to really avoid that siloed thinking. So the panel, which I'm about to introduce shortly, we want this to be a free-flowing conversation. We've got a few slides up front just for a scene set, but we really welcome your comments in the chat or the Q&A function as we go along. So we'll have some time for Q&A at the end, but certainly don't hold your comments and your reflections and your questions. I'd love to address those as we go through, where they're front of mind, to keep it really free-flowing. Skipping slides, sorry about that. So our panel, today's panel, made up of 3 leaders in the for-purpose space. And we really wanted to get a panel who had a real depth of experience across M&A and broader strategy, but also a panel that was really open to discuss, sharing and discussing their own professional development in this space over many years. And as we've been having some pre-conversations, there's been some really even interesting cross-sector conversations, even amongst the panel, that we'll hopefully touch on. So first up, we have Sally Hines. Sally is the Exec Director of strategy, growth, and transformation at each. Each are one of the most prominent community healthcare organisations operating right across the eastern seaboard. They are sector leaders across primary care, mental health, AOD, aged care, and other extended healthcare services. Sally is a senior leader across broader human services and the healthcare sector, and has led various strategy, government engagement, and advocacy initiatives. She's held various other exec positions, including the CEO of Leadership Victoria, the COO of The Big Issue, and leadership roles at Breast Cancer Network Australia and Headspace. At each, Sally has led the end-to-end organisation-wide strategic planning process, and then the subsequent M&A strategy directly with the CEO, exec team and board. And Sally brings a wealth of knowledge and experience on getting that real genuine organisational alignment and ownership across M&A. So welcome, Sally. Next, we have Mathew. Mathew McIntyre is the COO at the Disability Trust. The Disability Trust, as you probably know, is one of the largest disability providers in Australia. They operate across disability employment-based services and are one of the leading sector providers across client experience and advocacy. The Disability Trust have completed several major successful mergers over the last couple of years, and Mathew has over a decade of experience across disability employment and mental health sectors. He's also the chair of Disability Employment Australia and has held various senior exec positions across the disability and employment space. And as COO, Mathew has been really pivotal in leading across the recent M&A initiatives and has really deep experience across integration and very much the people side of things. So welcome, Mathew. And last but certainly not least, Jason Talbot, who's M&A principal consultant at Foundstone. Jason has over 20 years experience leading M&A strategy development, governance risk management and financial analysis, having worked in senior roles for Grant Thornton, Deloitte, NAB, EY, across both Australia and the UK. He's a qualified chartered accountant and sessional lecturer at Macquarie University, specialising in corporate acquisitions, finance and risk. Jason is a fellow of the Governance Institute of Australia and holds various board roles. Jason runs his own independent consultancy and is Foundstone Advisory's principal consultant across all things mergers and acquisitions, particularly in the for-purpose space. So welcome, Jason. All right. So just a quick bit of scene set of really why we're having the conversation today and some real trends that we're seeing across the for-purpose sector in this space. And as a strategy and impact advisory ourselves, we see firsthand, and even over the last, I'd say the last 6 to 12 months, there's been real momentum around M&A right across the sector. And this bit of research from Pitcher Partners, quite recent research, early 2025, that surveyed a broad pool of leaders in the sector, shows that more than 70% of NFP leaders expect to pursue mergers and acquisitions in the next 3 years. And that's up from just 15% in 2022. So quite a jump, and it was out of all the leadership categories, it was by far the biggest jump in all those. There was also quite an increase, as you can see there, in consolidation of service delivery, which I think is also a bit of a signal of pointing to the trends in the market. And although on the flip side, there was another piece of research, which I'll just mention briefly, from HLB Mann in the not-for-profit sector, that found that 60% of NFP leaders prioritise collaboration, but only 16% include M&A in their strategic plan. So we see this as a bit of a signal that there is more needed in around direct consideration of how M&A can really enable the broader strategic plan. Just a couple of quotes here from Paul Ronalds. You might have been across Paul in the past. He's currently the founder and CEO of Save the Children Global Ventures. And these couple of quotes have been really helpful for a number of our clients, the broader strategy community, and ourselves in really framing M&A. So Paul talks about that in the for-purpose sector, a merger is too often seen as a failure rather than as an opportunity to broaden reach, deepen expertise, or increase policy influence within government. And we see this firsthand, that those leaders who are looking at M&A as a potential opportunity to broaden their reach, expertise, and influence, as well as diversifying their own revenue and broadening impact, can be a really helpful way to look at it. There can be real upsides. There can be, of course, real challenges, which we'll touch on today. But I think this is a helpful frame to have boards and executive really leaning into doing their homework, having those tough conversations of whether we should be looking at M&A or not, and then why. And this other quote from Paul really speaks to the director duties side of things. So subject to your director duties, the merits of a decision should be determined by whether or not it advances the organisation's mission, not the organisation. Now, this can be quite a potentially confronting conversation, can't it? Because M&A can have an impact, of course, on existing structures and roles. But I think what Paul's pointing to here is that to be, as a director, or if you're an executive role, to be ultimately thinking about mission and purpose over the organisational structure is a really critical piece to the puzzle. And you could say quite a few organisations potentially have a choice at the moment whether they really lean into being proactive, having those real tough and proactive conversations, or potentially leaving it perhaps too late to then be more in a reactive defensive position, which isn't always ideal. And we see those organisations who are having those real front of face early conversations around how their mission could be advanced as being really profitable. And lastly, before we get into it, just very briefly, what's driving in M&A? You'd be all well and truly across it yourselves in your leadership roles. But there's just a few here that we wanted to highlight. Government revenue, obviously, there's the obvious ones, the overheads rising. There was just a few there: impact, industry lines, and digital, that I just wanted to highlight. Impact can be a really good lens to look at M&A by potentially combining organisations. How could that help us scale our impact from a diversification, perhaps versus specialisation, adjacent opportunities? Blurring of the traditional industry lines, we're seeing more and more leaders not looking at their industry just like the traditional best practice, fitting into neat industry lines, and really leaning into what's happening across potentially disability and aged care. We're seeing a lot of those traditional industries combining. And then lastly, digital footprint. Dare I mention AI as part of that? We're seeing that those organisations with that really mature digital footprint, there's perhaps less barriers of entry into those traditional geographic plays, so to keep front of mind. So without further ado, let's get into the panel conversation. And Sally, I might start with you if I could. When we look at the current broad sector macro settings and your experience at an organisational level over many years, why do you see it's really, or what is the why from the way you look at it, of why it's really critical to be proactive and to lead with intent around M&A?
Thank you. So I think being proactive is ensuring that you're building scale in your services in the service of purpose, but not despite it. So it holds purpose at the forefront of any kind of M&A strategy. So if I think about what we did at each, our M&A plan was actually built off our overall organisational strategy. So this is a process, if I think about when we started it to now, it's been going for about 1.5 years, talking about strategy and talking about M&As. So for us, the process at each of developing our strategy, and we call it our open strategy, so a process that engaged internal and external stakeholders, it started with answering 3 key questions. So going really big as we could in our thinking. So what can each be the greatest in the world? What does success look like for our customers in 10 years' time? And what does success look like for our organisation in 10 years' time? So throughout that process, we're identifying various moonshots, so bold ambitions we want to hold for the next 5 to 10 years. And the one that we linked to growth was to double our revenue within 4 years through growth, innovation, and mergers and acquisitions. So the strategic rationale that we gave to M&A was premised on kind of four ideas about why M&A should be embedded within our strategy. So the first and probably the most obvious, and I assume maybe a few people that are listening today are thinking about it, is that our financial sustainability, we believe, requires us to grow larger to create economies of scale. So there's definitely a financial underpinning absolutely to our M&A ambitions. So without surplus, if we're generating deficits, then we're causing a challenge in our ability to deliver on our vision and purpose anyway. We also truly believe at each that we deliver excellent services, and therefore we have an ambition to deliver those services in more locations. And so M&A is one mechanism with which to achieve that goal. As you've mentioned before, Andrew, so sector dynamics, and it's an increasingly competitive environment with tightening funding from government. So the idea that we would be able to tender our way or bid our way towards growth didn't seem possible. That kind of growth that we think is necessary. So yes, it's a lever, but it's not the biggest lever that we can pull because markets are tightening. And similar to what the gentleman from Save the Children spoke about is that advocacy perspective. So bigger does mean you are more likely to get a seat at the table. So with a bigger footprint, a bigger impact, we thought that we would have greater opportunity to influence the systems within which we operate so that our end user, so our customers, are receiving the best possible care depending on their needs. So with M&A embedded in our strategy, we sought the help of you guys, Foundstone, to help us to develop our M&A plan. And the way we did this was over multiple engagements with the exec team and the board. So those robust conversations around M&A and what it would mean for each moving forward were able to happen over quite a significant period. So from the time that we were starting to answer that question, what can we be the greatest at in the world, all the way through to developing that final M&A plan, we were talking about what it would mean for us as individuals, but also us as an organisation. So M&A is part of each's 50-year history. Each actually was established based on the merger of 3 organisations. But our new M&A plan and principle is tied directly to our organisational strategy. And it includes a focus on particular types of transactions with associated assessment criteria. So it's much more rigorous and scientific than perhaps the way that we've done M&A in the past. It's a structured approach. And it's got clear goals and ambitions and no-go zones as well, to be honest. So we've had those tough conversations. So what if each didn't exist anymore, but the services that we delivered to customers was still able to be delivered? And what if the exec team and board didn't exist in its current format? What would that mean? So having those conversations over that 1.5-year period has enabled those difficult, challenging friction points to kind of be exposed. The elephant in the room is talked about so that everyone has that opportunity to be heard. So I guess, being strategic in the way we approach M&A is all linked back to the purpose of the organisation and the vision that everyone has the power to live well. So that's the lens through which we see things. And it's not M&A because we're in a difficult position. It's M&A with a growth mindset in terms of what we can achieve as an organisation for the people that we serve.
Brilliant, thank you. Thank you for sharing that kind of mini journey over 1.5 years. Those incremental conversations, like you described, seemed really important, and being clear on the no-go zones and alignment. And we might get into a bit more of that as we go through. So thank you, Sally. Mathew, from a leader in this space, and having directly been involved in a number of those mergers over a shortish or a longish period of time, depends which way you look at it. Can you share with us a bit about why you see it's really critical to to take that proactive approach, and then your kind of thinking around how that's evolved from an implementation and even an integration perspective?
Yeah, definitely. Look, I think for us it's been a real journey. If I reflect back on it, our organisation probably about 2 years ago created a strategic direction very similar on the back of what Sally was saying around what does growth look like, we identified a number of streams of where those growth avenues could be activated, and M&A was a part of that. But there was also some objectives around scaled revenue growth, scaled service provision growth, and we sort of defined those into a number of streams, whether it was disability, employment, and mental health. So for our organisation, it was a real journey of where we entertained the concept that we were ready for growth. But what initially happened for us was merger activity became much more prevalent for us, and it became a conversation that, you know, was coming to life, whether it was through board or through CEOs. Relationships were starting to be formed, and that conversation was really coming to fruition. So for our organisation, we completed 3 mergers last year, all over a 3-month period, all of which those mergers were very different. Our 3 mergers were with OC Connections, Irma 365, and Marriott Support Services. And I think reflecting back on those mergers, each of them were different because each of the organisations were clearly in different sets of circumstances, but they were also at different sets of circumstances ready for change. And they also had different sets of lead-in times. So for our organisation and for our exec leadership team and at a peer level and more broadly, we were walking towards opportunity, and we were walking towards opportunity to have impact. And for us, I think that that's where the mergers really came to life. So what became quickly defined for our organisation was not about going in and doing a fast, aggressive takeover, system transformation on day dot, and impacting service provision. One of the things that we fundamentally walked towards was the opportunity of how do we ensure that service provision isn't compromised? Each of those 3 organisations had a very rich history that were embedded in their communities. They were providing high quality services. One of the gaps that they were confronted with, and there were some constraints, and they were all very different, but one of the gaps for some of those organisations, not all, was around corporate overhead, and how could our organisation help, I think, leverage some of those pain points. So for us, it was a real journey around not compromising the operations. It was certainly around how do we create scaled impact. And for us, our journey has been simply around really getting in and embedding ourselves into those organisations. So we weren't going in from day one with a Big Ben theory as such, where it was a takeover and their whole world was going to change. This was simply around us embedding ourselves in their organisation and really strategically taking our time to identify those opportunities that created advancements or enhancements for their organisations and efficiencies, but more broadly, also allowed for further scaled impact at what we do. And for that, you know, we've reaped the benefits of that, where we're seeing the organisations now really starting to collaborate strategically. We're seeing embedded operations across the group, and we're seeing greater outcomes for the people we support. So our approach has been, if you think about it, it's been a bit organic. There's been some strategy that's clearly sat behind it, but it's been also very opportunistic when we think about where we've grabbed those options along the way. And for us, I think it's been a huge success in taking that approach.
Brilliant. Thank you. I really like the way you describe, you know, walking towards an opportunity with impact, respecting the rich history of those other organisations, and then the reality of, you know, it takes time to embed. Myron's just asked a question there, and there's a couple coming through which I'll get to around that. But Jason, just on the why side of things, you know, having been involved, you know, leading M&A consultancy and advisory over a couple of decades, from the, you know, the bigger end of town globally, even the UK, to here, you know, just listening to Sally and Mathew, what's a bit of the why for you, and even, you know, those key principles of why organisations are actually looking at M&A, back to those kind of first principles?
Yeah, I mean, I think Sally and Mathew have touched on a lot of the things there, and you did in your intro as well. We're in an environment where M&A is becoming an increasingly important topic in the for-purpose sector. And it's, as you said, it's driven by things like organisations like each that have a growth mindset and want to grow and see that scale has an importance for them. But it's also can be driven by things like wanting to diversify services. You know, many of the problems that organisations are seeking to address and their purpose is aligned to are not simple problems. They're always very complex, and clients have a range of needs. And so integrating services can often be a key driver to help be almost a kind of one-stop shop for clients. It can also be about diversifying revenue. Many organisations are very reliant on government revenue and are seeking other alternatives so that they can have that diversity and a bit more, certainty and clarity over where they're going. But it's also, as both have touched on there, it's around cost savings. We're seeing revenues relatively flat, costs continue to rise, particularly people costs, and that kind of just continues to squeeze your profitability and your surpluses. And so for a lot of organisations, getting scale, saving that kind of back office expenditure can help them remain viable and financially viable. Although, as you touched on in the beginning, that shouldn't be the key driver. It should always be about purpose. And so I think taking a very strategic, deliberate approach to it is really key to success in these kind of transactions. When you're an organisation that sits in that kind of environment where there is a lot of M&A activity happening, there's a lot of talk about it, it's almost inevitable at some point an opportunity will present itself to your organisation, whether that be an opportunity to acquire something else or it's someone else coming to look to acquire you because they're seeking scale. And being prepared for that conversation and what that opportunity looks like will make it much more successful. If you're just reactive, you're likely to make or potentially could make a wrong decision there. You may quickly dismiss something because we're not a seller, or that's not where we want to go. Or you might find yourself spending a lot of time chasing an opportunity and following it when really it wasn't ideal in the first place. So I'd really encourage organisations to spend a lot of time when they're doing their strategic planning, when they're thinking about what's going on and what the future looks like, having an honest and robust conversation about M&A and where does it fit in that? Under what circumstances would we go and acquire something else? Under what circumstances would we allow ourselves to be merged with another organisation or be acquired? And how does M&A fit with our purpose, and how does it help us deliver better on purpose? Whether that be by growing scale and acquiring, or whether it be being part of a larger organisation and therefore being more sustainable and able to deliver further. So it's really, I think, critical when you're in an environment where activity is happening around you. You don't just sit back and be passive and wait for it to come onto your door. You actually think about it strategically and have those conversations before the opportunity is there and before you're in the excitement of what could be. You've had it in a calm, rational kind of way, and it leads to a much better outcome, I think, in the future.
Brilliant, thank you. And I think you've kind of addressed, there's a couple of questions coming in, which I'm going to turn to now to keep it kind of live. In terms of, Myron, were the opportunities discussed more broadly strategic versus opportunistic? And then Peter mentions to Mathew specifically as well, can you illustrate some of the steps that opened up the early engagement? So Mathew, in terms of strategic versus opportunistic, I don't know, it's not always that binary, is it? Can you perhaps comment on that? And is there anything you could share around how those early stage conversations might have been opened up?
Yeah, good question, Myron. I think when we look back on the mergers, there is a combination between both. All three were technically strategic in alignment to what we did, and but there was also a lot of this was built on opportunity. So, these discussions didn't happen without the opportunity becoming live for us to consider. So I think that is probably the truth. So there's a bit of both, if I'm being really honest, in all of this. I think there was a genuine appetite strategic for us to expand into those areas, but there was also the opportunity for those to be considered. I think around Peter's question around, the steps that we sort of opened up that early engagement, I actually think for all three of our mergers were very different, but fundamentally, really sat at our chair and CEO at the time, having strong early engagement, particularly with board and CEO. And what certainly was discussed in that, and you'd almost describe it as a discovery phase, but there was a series of conversations which I think fundamentally brought to life. There was a genuine values alignment. There was a general alignment in thinking. There was a general alignment that our views were not to come in and break organisations. Our view was, how do we create scale and impact? And in that, there were synergies built. So that discovery phase really allowed I think a more broadly a partnership conversation to be formed throughout that engagement piece. And if you can think about it in a number of different ways, whether that's strategic or not, but there was really that's how the partnerships were felt. There was a genuine belief and alignment into where we were heading, and that actually had tentacles that sort of complemented each of those organisations. Some of those processes were longer than others. So, for some of the lead-in times, we had 8 to 12 months for a couple of those organisations. And for one of those organisations, we had about sort of an 8-week lead-in time. So from the first conversation to the transaction. So, these things can move at speed, and they can also move over time. And I think there's a combination between not wanting to rush and to be too pushed in that process. I think there's steady as she goes is the expression, and I think it's a bit of that sort of thinking in this is where from our perspective, we felt it was critical for us to be truly respectful of those organisations. So yeah.
Great, thank you. It's really helpful. And Sally, just briefly on, you talked about the process that you've run over 1.5 years, those incremental conversations. So strategic, looking at it strategic v opportunistic. Any brief comment on that from yourself?
I think because we've had the conversations and we've developed the plan, it means that we're prepared for both strategic and opportunistic. So there's a question in there about the cost to undertake the process to develop the M&A plan. It's an investment in the organisation, and it's saving us time now as we're actively pursuing M&A. So having a plan in place and a clear strategy means that there are time efficiencies that we're developing now, where we're not wasting time pursuing things that aren't necessarily relevant to each. So for me, it's a strategic investment to make for the future of the organisation to have that plan in place. But for us, there's, even if I think about this year, there's been 3 opportunistic things that have come across our desk. But with the plan in place, we can assess them for whether we want to spend more time looking at them. I think both, I agree, it's not black and white, that it's an either or, because sometimes you don't know about something, and then actually, if you had have known about it, it probably would have been a strategic focus as well. So you don't know everything, because, within the sector, we're not sharing everything every day about what's going on in our organisation. So sometimes the opportunistic is the opportunity that you need to look at.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you.
So I'm just going to add on to that too. I think that the important thing about having the strategy is that you then can look at the strategic and the opportunistic. Whereas if you don't have the strategy, you'll only ever see the opportunistic. And when you see them, you won't be able to assess whether it's a good idea or not, because you haven't spent that time thinking about what you're actually looking for and what's going to be a good transaction. And you could burn a lot of time following something that's not worthwhile, or dismiss something very quickly that you should have actually looked at more closely.
Brilliant. Yeah, thanks for that addition. All right, so I'm gonna move on into some of the insights and learnings, and what are some of the opportunities and pitfalls throughout the process, and perhaps we might try to address some of the questions coming through. As you noted, Sally, there's a couple of questions in there. Katrina, I saw your question around the Pitcher Partner study. So it was an Australian study. I'm not sure exactly the amount, but we'll send that study out and link, and you'll be able to read that, and we can summarise it in itself. So in terms of some of the insights and learnings and the opportunities and pitfalls, perhaps, as panellists, keep in mind the questions around what are some of the costs involved, and even some of the best benchmarking aspects. Mathew, if I could perhaps go back to yourself in terms of your learnings, and even I'd love to hear, from your own professional development, because I know over many years, you lean into these sort of things. Is there a couple of things of, what's been front of mind for both your professional development and those opportunities and pitfalls, looking at M&A holistically?
Yeah, I think, look, fundamentally, the merger space, when the merger activity is commencing, you start to move really at rapid speeds. And I think fundamentally, the thing that I've learned, there's been a number of things, but I think there's a couple of things. I think at a peer level, it's been a really, really great experience. I think at a peer level, I think it's really challenged our organisation in a good way. And it's allowed our organisation to grow and really change its thinking. I think it's allowing us to have scaled impact. So we're seeing different scales of impact than we had previously. I think on a development level, one of the things that it's probably done for me is I think I had, going into some of these conversations, that the mergers really, the actions and the transformational and the integration stuff needed to happen at sort of fast speeds, where in reality, probably going through the way in which we've approached those mergers, it's allowed for me to probably develop a more stronger level of resilience around being patient and conservative in that thinking. I think, one of the things you look for is, and I touched on it before, this big bang thing where there's huge change that needs to happen straight away. And for sometimes they're unavoidable. So I'm not going to sit here and declare that things haven't changed, because they have. But in reality, for us, what it's actually allowed us to do is to carefully observe our group and really leverage that for benefit. So I think that's probably the biggest one in the learning curve for me, is having that more of a strategic lens at the overall overview of the group and grabbing those opportunities that enhance greater scaled impact. I think for us, that's where the real learning sat. And I think real purpose is sat in what we do, to be really honest.
Yeah, great. Thank you. And just while we're with you, I know we won't get in depth to this. There's a question from Mark there around benchmarking. And there's been a lot of benchmarking done in the disability sector in itself, hasn't there? And I've seen some of those. And Mark kind of references that, even that 50 mil mark. Is there any kind of just high level thinking on benchmarking, and then even to Katrina's question around the overall costs, how you think about that at a high level?
For a merger, yeah. Look, I think the benchmarking it's really interesting because it's grabbing snapshots of organisations that potentially are quite diverse. So
Yes.
For us, our greatest strength is our diversification, if I think back to it, and that's allowing for financial sustainability in a number of different areas. So I think the benchmarking, there's absolutely some total relevance in all of that, so I don't want to dismiss it at all. But I do think for our organisation, is it a proportion of our consideration. In regards to undertaking the level of costs and really getting the M&A activity to happen as a starting point, I think for us, we invested into it at the beginning because we got some external advice. We really helped shape up our thinking on it. We also challenged the way in which we were, commercially approaching the M&A activity. And it also was really good at a safeguarding point. But what we've certainly found through us is that those M&A costs have sort of started to consolidate because there's a level of org maturity and resources that is developed throughout this. So for us, it's one of those things where it will be a continual moving sort of feast. And there's learnings at every single conversation that we've had along the way. But I think that that sort of investment piece is a great starting point in the consideration. It gives you a level of confidence, but it also gives you, if you look at it from the humanistic perspective, you're not wedged into one way of doing things. You have the choice in making how you want to approach the conversations, the decisions you're making. So, that's probably where we're at with that.
Great, thank you. And Sally, so broadly, having led the organisation-wide strategy as you talked through, and then the M&A strategy, and then the early conversations, how do you think about the insights and learnings from organisation on your different roles over a period of time, and then any opportunities and pitfalls that is front of mind in this area for you?
The thing that I can compare to, so one of the reasons I came to each was because of the growth ambition of the CEO. So this is 3 years before I started, but also an ambition to do things with rigor and with appropriate governance structures in place. So there's some commentary in the chat around it being board's responsibility, but also how egos and personalities can get in the way. So for me, the difference between what I've seen at each and on boards that I've been on in the past is that by having that clear plan in place that's endorsed by the board means that us as the management have clear guardrails around what if M&A activity is presented to us, or we're proactively trying to find people to work with and collaborate with and partner with, we know where the escalation points are to the board, and we know when it's something that we can manage at a management level. So board M&A obviously sits at a board level, like it's a governance issue for boards. But in not-for-profit boards, particularly the smaller organisations under 50 million, you've got not-for-profit board members who are volunteers. So by default, I would assume, and what I've experienced is that management is involved in the day-to-day, looking for transactions, looking for partnerships and looking for collaboration. So in the absence of having a plan and agreed guardrails, it means that either as management, every time something crosses your desk, you're having to escalate it to the board to know what you should do with it. Or alternatively, as management, you can be jumping at the bright, shiny things without any clear guardrails on that. That's not an opportunity for us. So you're spending a lot of time, there's a lot of wheels spinning before something might actually happen. So for me, I guess, yeah, the pitfall is no plan means you're often at a board level are prosecuting people's opinions. It's not about fact, or it's not about what's in the best interest of the organisation necessarily. It's just about what each individual board member might think about that particular target. So the plan gives you the agreed principles from which to assess an opportunity. So for me, that is probably the biggest one, and the biggest gain we've had from the plan process is that as management, we know, as we're talking and networking with people, we know where a go zone is and where a no-go zone is.
Prosecuting people's opinions, I think that's a great way to look at it, because it's so true, isn't it? If that's what you're doing just ongoing, the time that can be spent on that, I think it's a really helpful frame. Thank you. And Jason, holistically, you know, being involved in this space over many years, and maybe you could even touch on, as Sally mentioned, those couple of those James mentions, you know, the without the financial incentives of share ownership, etc., you know, egos and organizational identity, what frameworks or narratives help to improve those leaders towards shared purpose? Can you speak to that a bit?
Yeah, I'd say even with financial incentives, those sort of things come out as well. So it's not it's not particular to not-for-profits. But yeah, look, I think, yeah, there are a lot of things that make a transaction successful or not successful, and every transaction is different. It has its own nuances depending on the organisations involved in the sector and so on. But there are a lot of commonalities amongst them, and you know, there are other things that make it successful, like having the clear plan, being really focused about what it is you're hoping to get out of that transaction, what are going to be the success metrics and so on, and really doing solid due diligence. And all that's probably, you know, fairly obvious and known. The things that do become less obvious but that can really derail a transaction is the human element of it. You know, we talk about organisations coming together, but ultimately it's people who are making those decisions. It's people that are driving the transaction. It's people that are negotiating the deal, and they have their own biases and their own ideas of success and their own things that drive them and hold them back. And that all plays out in the deal and can make a huge difference. And, you know, so Sally talking about there about if you didn't have the guardrails, you end up taking every opportunity to the board. Equally, you might have someone who doesn't want to deal with that, and so doesn't take any opportunity to the board, and the board never gets to see these kind of things. It also plays out in ways, you know, if you're putting two organisations together, quite often you don't need two CEOs, and so someone's going to lose their job out of that. And yeah, at an individual level, that can really drive some thinking and behaviour. You've got a board who needs to make the decision. There'll be people on that board who are really excited and keen to get on with the transaction and want to make it happen. There will also be people on that board who are terrified by the idea and think it's going to destroy the organisation. And you've got to try and manage through those different opinions. And not that one's right or wrong, but the board has to come to a collective decision around these things. And so you need to manage those kind of nuances. And then when you're in a deal too, it's very, you know, as Mathew said, these deals move at pace, and there's a bit of adrenaline and there's a bit of excitement, and it's really fun. And oh, I'm doing a deal, isn't this great? People can get carried away with that and continue on down the path. And we've invested 6 months in this. We've just got to see it through. We've got to make it happen, even in the face of overwhelming evidence to say this is going to be a bad deal. But they'll push through with it to make it happen. So you've got to kind of be aware of those things and manage all those potential challenges, because yeah, the people element of it, the ego side of it, can really get in the way and derail a deal or lead you to do a deal that you shouldn't have done, or just mess the whole thing up entirely. And then once you've done it, then you've got all the people challenges around integration and how you make that work and bringing two cultures together and all that type of thing as well. But that's probably another webinar.
So true. Just before we finish on that, Jason, so Heidi's asking a question. Do you have any advice for a situation where there is a lot of strategic alignment, mission, values, etc., but there is a significant misalignment on one area which is seen as key by one organisation? I know, you know, we do a lot of, you know, you do a lot of work on criteria, strategic logic, those aspects. Is there any quick thoughts around that?
Yeah, look, it's a important thing to see what level of alignment there is. It probably depends a lot on what the issue is that they're misaligned at. I guess both organisations have to sit there and look at how important is that issue to us. It might be very important to one, but not so important to the other, and that can be a way of finding a way around it. There might be other ways of looking at the deal and structuring the deal that will give you opportunities for that issue to be less important. So, for example, we're talking here mergers, essentially one organisation acquiring another, but maybe there's another way that those two can have a relationship that gets most of the benefits that they're looking for, some sort of joint venture, partnership or something, or even sitting in a group type model where both entities continue to exist, but maybe they share back office organisations or share a governance structure, that type of thing. So looking for different ways of doing the transaction and bringing those organisations together to achieve the strategic goals that you want, to achieve the delivery of purpose that you're looking for, might be suitable. That'll help alleviate some of those issues. As I say, without having the specifics, it's a bit hard to kind of come up with a definitive answer. But looking at alternatives, I think, is probably a key to that.
Great, thank you. Just conscious of time. So in terms of if we just look at the kind of the final frame of thinking of how those people on the call and broader, the how, when we've touched on it a fair bit, but more explicitly, how organisations and leaders can start to mature the way they're having those early stage conversation in engagement and their own strategic thinking. Mathew, is there any other kind of thinking or points that you could share around the how part?
Probably, and I just saw some comment in there. I think look, our board definitely had an appetite for growth in the M&A space, but as I said, the executive did as well. And so I think having that sort of joint alignment is where the how comes to life, where the board and in particular the CEO and the executive are singing from the same song sheet, I think is really critical. I think for us, it's not been going about and knocking on doors and those sorts of things. I think our opportunities have come through, there's been relationships formed and partnerships, and as such, it's led down a path where M&A has come to life. So I think from my perspective, really just having that genuine alignment at the governance level of the organisation, but also at the executive. And there's just got to be, the thing for the M&A space, from my perspective, is you've got to have an appetite to entertain it. So that means that you're continually talking about the opportunity, you continually challenge your thinking on it. And at the point of where these things come to life, you're in a far greater place than sort of running at it blind. So I think if there's appetite for conversation, keeping it on the table on a regular basis is where it should begin.
Yeah, and you talked about before about being patient. I think that's a good reminder. The walking towards, I think they're really helpful. Sally, from a how point of view, in terms of how organisations can even have those early stage conversations, and your own how are you looking at that?
So we are being quite upfront at each that M&A is part of our strategy moving forward. And so when we're having conversations with peers, so as an executive team, we have peers in other organisations. So I meet with my counterpart at this organisation, but my peer also does. So what Matt was saying before about singing from the same song sheet, we are all have the same message when we're talking about what each's future ambitions are. And we're open with sharing, I guess, our thinking around mergers and acquisition, but also partnership and collaboration. So when we're meeting with counterparts in other organisations, we're talking about what's going on in the sector and where our organisation is heading, not just whatever project we might be working on, but I guess those more broad-ranging and philosophical conversations. So I guess for us, relationships are at the basis of M&A. Successful M&A is going to be based on good relationships. So we invest heavily in being good collaborators in the spaces that we work and good partners with our peers. And our peers are also our competitors, but I think there's a way you can compete and be kind at the same time. So that's definitely, I guess, how we approach it. And I think, my own personal how and education, So yeah, I'm a long time viewer of M&A activity, never done a deal, Matt. Watch what your deals. So have ambition, because I think it's the way of the future for the not-for-profit sector. That I think that mission and purpose supersedes any individual organisation ambition. So I think that will continue to be part of our sector. So for me, LinkedIn, whether you love it or loathe it, it is a wealth of information around mergers and acquisitions at the moment. There are posts daily sharing information, but also sharing research, but also Social Ventures Australia have done quite a bit of case studies as well in terms of looking at transactions, what led to them, and then, what went wrong, what they could have done better. So I do spend a lot of time trawling around LinkedIn. Someone suggested a community of practice. If you start it, I'll join it. So yeah, I think there's a lot of us thinking about it. I don't think a lot of people are talking about it because it's seen as a bit too aggressive, maybe for the not-for-profit sector, but I think we just need to destigmatize M&A as a bad thing, because I think it's a good thing for the customers that we serve.
Brilliant, thank you, very practical. And Jason, from a how point of view, and I might just turn to, if we might not be able to answer all these questions specifically. Patrick's asking there, how might you influence a potential M&A target who is not financially viable in the short, medium term, and is still reluctant to let go and give up control? And a couple of others in that similar vein, targeted takeover. Have you got any, from a how point of view, I know it's hard to address those specifically, but any high-level thinking around that, of what's happening at the moment?
Yeah, that's a really challenging position. And unfortunately, there are a lot of organisations out there that are like that are kind of hanging on and probably should be looking at doing something differently. And that doesn't necessarily mean being acquired. It could mean they can restructure their organisation to become financially viable. But there are a lot of organisations that are sitting out there not wanting to let go and wanting to hang on. And unfortunately, ultimately, they'll probably end up just dying a slow, painful death, as opposed to some other alternative where the purpose and mission can continue. But I can understand why they do that. I mean, I've sat on a board myself where we came to the difficult decision of we needed to be acquired. We weren't going to be sustainable as we were. And it's a long, hard, slow process. It probably took us 8 to 12 months as a board to make that decision. Because it's not easy, because you think your organisation's important and what you're doing is important, and it is. But if it's not going to be around in 12 months' time, then that doesn't really matter. You actually need to look at the bigger picture and the purpose and so on. So I think for organisations, it's really having those honest, robust conversations about where does M&A fit, and are we an organisation that should be part of something larger and therefore potentially taken over, or are we looking to acquire? Why are we doing it? What does it look like? But even if you're the acquirer, having an honest conversation with yourself about what's our capability and ability to actually take on a transaction, to integrate two organisations, to take on a new culture, all that kind of stuff, because they're a lot of fun. I wouldn't have done it for 20 years if I didn't think M&A was fun, but they're very risky. They're very resource intensive. They'll have a huge impact on your organisation, not just while you're doing it, but into the future as well. So you've really got to be clear and honest about why you want to do that and why you're going into it, and what your capability to do that is, and where you have gaps and where you need to get others involved. So if you're sitting there as an acquirer and you've got an organisation that's a great target and you're trying to influence them to make that decision, really, I guess all you can do if they're hanging on is just continue those conversations, keep talking to them about the benefits of what bringing the two organisations would be together would be like. Try to unpack what are some of their challenges. Why are they finding it hard to say yes? Let's talk about this transaction. Why they're wanting to hang on, and maybe by unpacking those positions a little bit more, you might find there's an alternative way in which you can work together as a stepping stone into something that's perhaps a little bit more formal. Yeah, again, a kind of joint venture, a partnership, working on a project together, that type of thing, that might help ease that transition for the other organisation. And also from your point of view, helps you to get to know them a lot better and know that organisation more deeply. So you know what the skeletons in the closet are, and so you're not going to get stuck with something that you actually don't want to be left with in the end. So yeah, challenging situation, but I guess it's just about continuing the conversation and talking with them.
Thank you. We're nearly at time, but there's a couple of wrap-up slides, but I'd rather send them out afterwards. I just want to address the last couple of questions. So Christian, really interesting question there from you. Has the panel seen much activity in merging organisations that are different but aligned to address their organisational lack of diversification, risk, for example, mental health and AOD orgs intentionally coming together versus two organisations coming together to simply do more of the same? There's a bit in that. Is there any comments broadly on that from the panel?
I'll give you a broad general response. Yes, it does happen. The challenge is, what do you mean by different but aligned? And often, different but aligned can mean you're just very different. And one organisation thinks diversity is the way to go, and then you haven't really fully appreciated the differences and what that means, and how those organisations are going to fit together, and it can be disastrous in the end for both organisations. Again, we've said it several times on this call, being really clear about your strategic intent of why you're doing it. Why do you want to get something different? How is that helping you deliver on your purpose better? What are going to be the benefits and risks of that? And how are we going to manage those risks? And being really honest about those differences and challenges, and how those differences will fit with your organisation, can mean a different but aligned transaction will be successful. As I say, more often than not, organisations don't think like that. They just think, oh, diversity is good, we'll go for it. And that's where they get into trouble down the track.
True. I mean, what I observed firsthand, I mentioned at the start, there is those, we are moving beyond just those neat industry lines. Disability and aged care is a clear example of that. We're seeing a lot more activity in those areas. And you mentioned mental health and AOD. I am observing those conversations happening. What could organisations look at an merged across those different disciplines? So I think they are happening. But again, I think it really comes back to, and just a brief summary, really to wrap up, we talked about from the panel, having those incremental conversations over a period of time, walking towards, and my thought went to, as opposed to running towards, Mathew, having those organic conversations. And what I've been hearing is encouraging to, once you've got your clear criteria and strategy, have those early stage conversations, because you get a lot of insight from that. Taking a real, deliberate approach so that you avoid being reactive. And as Sally, you mentioned, avoid that, prospecting through opinions. Whenever we're getting down to an opinions point of view across executive and boards, we know that, we can kind of just go in a circle. So I think what I've been hearing is getting really clear criteria and alignment, while being patient, and the collaborative side. And you mentioned, Sally, I observed that the for-purpose sector is moving into that more competitive space, which there is some silver lining around that, isn't there? Collaborating, competing, but being kind. I think that's a really nice way to put it. So hopefully we've got to most questions. We'll go through at the end afterwards, and if there's anything specific, I'll reach out and answer those. Thank you to the panelists for really leaning in and sharing both, organisationally, professionally, and sector-wise. I think it's been a really practical and insightful conversation. So thank you all. We will be sending out some of those research and reports from this, and a couple of other ways to think about progressing. So thank you all. Excellent questions and comments from attendees. So I really appreciate that. And we look forward to the next one. Thanks very much. Cheers.